The Zoom has started giving me some anxiety now. Live, boss.
Already coming in?
Yeah, there is AJAI, I think. Good morning, Ajay.
Morning, Ajay.
No, you are on mute. Now I have unmuted you. How are you? Good morning.
Good morning. How are you, Ajay?
Very, very well.
How's the weather in Nilgiris?
Weather is a little dull today. Otherwise, normally you have bright sunshine at this time of the morning. And in the afternoon,
Which part of Nilgiris are you in?
Near Kunur.
Kunur.
Oh.
Okay. Good.
Talk for a minute. Let me check your audio and then I'll open it up for the public to join.
Audio check. We should just go over the slide thing also.
Sure.
Yeah.
So that I don't have.
Certainly.
Audio check. 1, 2, 3, 4. Good morning. Good morning. How are you? Hello from the Nilgiris. There's been a lot of visibility on Twitter for this talk.
Yes.
Yeah. There's no China in Nilgiris, right?
Yeah.
So can you do share screen?
Sorry?
Can you do share screen now? You want to try out the share screen?
Share screen.
At the bottom.
Then I do what next?
Then you pick up the presentation. Double click on the presentation after you do share screen. That's
Okay.
it. Then go to the beginning of the presentation. Go to the first slide. Click on that and then click on show at the bottom.
Yeah.
That's it.
So you've got the
Yes,
slide as you want.
Absolutely. Right. You can stop sharing and then I'll open up. I think we are good.
Open up. So I will not be able to go. I thought I'd go and take a leak just before starting.
You can do that. You can do that.
Enough time.
We won't start before 10:30, so you can do it.
Okay. So I can go at 10:25.
Yeah, no problem.
And can you unshare the screen?
Unshare the screen, meaning you are screen sharing.
Stop. Yeah. Okay. So you can come back at 10:29. I'll allow people to now come in.
Okay.
Right.
So I'll join at 10:25 then.
Sure.
Yeah.
10:29 is fine. Don't worry.
Okay.
Right.
Great.
Okay. Okay, people are joining in.
Yeah, you do the opening, right?
Okay.
What you see? Silent. Put of the internet devices.
Apparently, they clipped off the last 2 minutes of the Prime Minister's video. Is it correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Oh,
The Wire wrote about that.
I read it in some other context.
We are also live, Ajay, on YouTube at this point.
Oh, I
So,
see.
so we will have almost twice as many viewers there on YouTube than on Zoom.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
My YouTube critics are saying, "What are you doing using Zoom? It's a Chinese platform."
No, actually, it's owned by Chinese American, right?
I'm not even sure of that.
That's what someone told me.
You know, when you want to criticize, it's enough कि उसने Chinese food खाया है पिछले 7 दिनों में, वो Chinese बन गया है.
Correct, correct. I'm afraid to have gobi Manchurian now. Unfortunately, like many other things in this case, the Chinese don't even know a dish like this exists.
There is absolutely no vegetable Manchurian in China. This I can
I'm
tell you.
sure. I'm sure. When did you shift into Kunur?
Oh, I'm still in the process of shifting. I'm building a house here, and over the next year, I guess I will divide my time between
Otherwise, Delhi, is it?
Otherwise, I'm mostly in Delhi. So far, we've been basing out of Delhi. Let's be back.
What?
Vikram, Zoom behaves in a strange way. There are a dozen people who have joined in my name.
Exactly. I was about to ask you the question. I see this question.
I have no. Look at the participants.
Yeah. Except Nasir, who came last, and he says, "I want to ask a question." The other 4 questions are all in your name.
No, but look at the participants.
Yeah.
It's a I mean, every event we face something.
Oh, wow. I knew you were always a Dashavatar case, but this is proof. Why?
I have no idea.
Maybe you should ask him to exit and rejoin.
So I have a friend who just texted me, and I'll read his text. Poor Eric Yuan would never have thought he would ever get embroiled in a controversy like this ever. Zoom is American, so is Yuan. He's as much American as Sundar Pichai is.
Yeah, that's a fact. Q&A, I see 6 Q&As already there.
Yeah. So someone wanted to ask a question, and I said I would much rather, he would much rather want to talk after the talk, address the questions after the talk.
He wanted to ask the question before the talk.
He wanted to ask now because we are waiting for 10:30 to ask.
Okay, okay. You'll start with an introduction or something?
Correct. 1 minute introduction. That's all.
Yeah.
And then it's all yours. You
Yeah,
take.
put the laptop charger. But Sonia, there's no you'll have to put off this light, put off this lamp, the leftmost switch.
Ajay, you are asking too many questions.
Look at.
Which Ajay?
No, oh, sorry. I'm talking about not you. I'm talking about
There was a different comment while you were away. Zoom is misbehaving. It has allowed several people in my name.
He's frozen.
Ajay, are you on? Ajay? He's probably rejoining.
You can't copy and paste on Zoom, is it?
I don't know.
I'm not able to, frankly.
There you are.
Yeah. Salil says you can copy and paste, but admin has to give permission.
Ajay, are you in?
Do you get it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right? Shall we start?
Yeah, whenever you're ready.
Yes.
Shall I go on to share screen?
No, give me a minute. That's all. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome this morning to this most awaited talk on China. Actually, the issues with China have been disturbing all of us so much. It affects us in many ways, including questions on our national pride and integrity. We really want to know what's actually happening down there. What is the thinking in the minds of the Chinese government and our government? Was our government adequately prepared and was it doing the right things, or were we caught pants down? So there are many issues that we need to understand and worry about, and most of us are not as aware about what's happening as we ought to be. And we therefore thought we'll reach out to our speaker of the day, Colonel AJAI Shukla. Ajay is one of those rare professionals who's not only an expert on matters of defense, international relations, and related things, but he's also one who is brave, outspoken, and is unwilling to, is happy to speak truth to power. We need someone like him to come and talk to us. And I'm so happy that he has agreed magnanimously to come and spend the next 90 minutes with us. Thank you, Ajay. We are honored to have you with us. It's all yours.
Okay. Before we start, shall I move on to share screen mode?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Share screen. Okay. Are we okay now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So Ajay, thank you so much for that extremely generous introduction. Hello, everybody, the rest of the people, the audience who have given up their Sunday morning in order to deal with this very depressing question that we're facing right now. I am juggling multiple balls, as it were, in doing this presentation. This is the first time I'm doing a Zoom presentation with slides, and we're doing it from the Nilgiris, where the electricity supply is not too great, where internet connection is sometimes patchy. So I will request all of you to bear with me as I juggle these balls. If something goes off, just stay with us. We'll try and restore connectivity as soon as possible. So we are talking today about the restless border with China, the ongoing intrusions that are exercising all of our policymakers, that is tying up the military on the border. On June 15th, as you all know, after a 40-day standoff between troops of the PLA and the Indian Army, the situation exploded into violence in a sort of almost caveman type encounter between two nuclear powers. Soldiers attacked each other with clubs, with rods tied with barbed wire, threw each other over cliffs to their deaths. In several hours of fighting, about 20 Indian soldiers were killed. An unknown number of Chinese would also have lost their lives, I assume. The Chinese casualty numbers are not known with any certainty. India has said 43 Chinese were killed, but Beijing called that fake news. But the fact is that regardless of how many Chinese were killed, or even if none of them were killed, the situation we face now is the most dangerous, the most perilous that we have faced since the 1967 Nathula encounter, when several hundred soldiers from both sides were killed. That situation was controlled. It never escalated any further, and we hope that this current situation also is managed the same way. So over the next, I guess, about 45 minutes or so, leaving 45 minutes for Q&A, we'll talk about this huge defense and foreign policy crisis and which way it could go. So to put things in sort of perspective, I'll start by really giving you a sort of very broad oversight of the border question between India and China, the dimensions where the issues are really located. Then we'll talk about what has happened over the last 2 months, what could be driving it, what direction it can go, what are the key factors in it. And finally, we'll get on to Q&A and sort of take on specific issues that members of the audience would like answers about. So let me start by screen sharing. Do I stop sharing, Ajay?
No, you can just advance to the next slide.
Okay, this is not advancing. Should I just exit and come back inside?
No, just press. You see that slideshow, that arrow on the right?
At the bottom.
Okay, there's a different thing. Okay, now I get it now.
That's it.
Okay, so that's a quick look at the landscape of Ladakh for you, just to give you a sort of sense of what kind of terrain this entire episode is playing out in. The valley floor that you see before you, with green trees and a few houses and so on, that's normally located at between 12,000 and 14,000 feet altitude above sea level. And the mountains that you see rise off about 3,000 to 4,000 feet off the valley floor. So they're about at altitudes of anything between 16 to 18,000 feet. It's rugged terrain, very low oxygen levels, very difficult for soldiers to operate, very difficult for machinery to operate because they often jam because of the cold. All in all, a very inhospitable environment for military operations, but incredibly beautiful to look at. And that's why you get so many tourists and so on coming. And perhaps that's why we've got countries fighting over it now. So coming on to the boundary dispute itself, I thought I'd just give you a few sort of pointers to the dimensions of the problem. We often talk about a border dispute, but this is far more. The Indo-China border boundary question is far more than a border dispute. It is a full-blown territorial dispute over about 130 to 140,000 square kilometers of land. That's a chunk of territory about the size of Nepal or Bangladesh. Now the dispute is spread across 3 widely separated sectors. You see them marked in red over there on the slide. There's the western sector, the central sector, and the eastern sector. The western sector includes Ladakh's borders with Tibet and Xinjiang. It is the primary bone of contention right now in the high altitude sort of warfare that is going on between the two sides. Warfare, I'm sort of using in its broader sense. It is mainly comprising a very barren, high altitude desert called the Aksai Chin. It's marked there on the thing. You see the western sector looks a little like a question mark. And the upper part of the question mark is the boundary, is the territory of Aksai Chin. It measures some 35,000 square kilometers. For China, how did the Aksai Chin come to have any value at all, given that it's completely barren and nothing grows there? The reason for China's interest in the Aksai Chin and its possession over it is that it has built the strategic Western highway through this territory. It passes right through the Aksai Chin. This is a highway called G219 in the Chinese terminology. It connects Tibet with Xinjiang, both being outlying provinces with a long history of sort of resentment and separatism and uprising against the Chinese mainstream. India claims the Aksai Chin based on old maximalist British claims. How much control India really exercised over the Aksai Chin is an open question. Suffice to say that when China built the highway through it, and the highway goes a couple of 100 kilometers through the Aksai Chin, India only found out about the highway when Chinese press reports in 1957 announced that the highway was being inaugurated. So Nehru certainly recognized that the Aksai Chin had little strategic value for India. That's the map again. The black line that you see over there is the Western Highway. The territory marked in magenta is the Aksai Chin, and it passes right through the highway. The highway passes right through the Aksai Chin, as you can see. So Nehru realized that this had little strategic value for India, but having officially claimed it once in the initial maps that were published of India, especially the 1954 map, which conclusively showed it as a part of India, walking away from that claim was always going to be politically difficult, especially, and here's the interesting part, not from the sort of right-wing parties, but the main opposition was coming and the main nationalistic upsurge was coming from the right wing of the Congress party itself, leaders like Govind Ballabh Pant. Now, the problem was highlighted in Parliament in December 1961, and Nehru, answering Mahavir Tyagi, who was a Congress leader over there, tried to talk down the value of the Aksai Chin. He told the Parliament, and I quote exactly his phrase, "No tree grows anywhere in this wide area. There may be some shrubs." And Mahavir Tyagi pointed to his own bald head and said, "No hair grows on my head. Does it mean the head has no value?" So you get a sense of the sort of emotional dimensions of the problem. Nobody is willing to let go of territory, regardless of how useful or useless it actually is. So besides Aksai Chin, the Western sector dispute also includes, and now I take you down to the dot of the question mark, below the main question mark, a 500 square kilometer pocket of land near Demchok, slightly to the south. And in the 1962 war, China occupied another 3,000 square kilometers in Ladakh. So that also is still continues to be held by China. Then in 1963, Pakistan ceded to China the Shaksgam Valley. You see that brown territory over there marked Shaksgam Valley. That's about 5,180 square kilometers. It was just ceded by Pakistan to China in a provisional agreement that China says is subject to final settlement of the J&K border between Pakistan and India. So coming back to this map, we come to the central sector. It's on a frontage of 545 kilometers. That includes the Himachal and Uttarakhand borders with Tibet. You see those two little dots over there. It's a sort of relatively minor dispute in the central sector, and most people believe that if China and India can resolve the Aksai Chin and the Arunachal Pradesh issues, the central sector will get resolved on its own. It's not a very sort of serious problem. It consists mainly of the Barahoti plain. Now, of course, there is this new problem which has come up over the last couple of months of a little piece of territory called Kalapani near the Lipu Lake Pass on the tri-junction between Nepal, India, and Tibet. That's not strictly an India-China problem. It's more an India-Nepal problem. But suffice to say that it has come into sort of the limelight once again. Then you come to Arunachal Pradesh, where just let me open this. So you come to Arunachal Pradesh, that is another major problem. That is 90,000 square kilometers of territory disputed between India and China. It is called South Tibet by China. It is called Arunachal Pradesh. It has changed its name over the years from NIFA, Northeastern Frontier Agency, to Arunachal Pradesh as a union territory and now as a full-fledged state of India. So altogether, this amounts to a solid 140,000 square kilometers. For the rest of the talk today, we are going to be focusing really on the Ladakh part, the Aksai Chin. That is the part which is currently in the limelight. This is not to say that it will not sort of become an issue in the sort of coming days as well. There are already indications that China might be lining up on the border with that particular area. That is Arunachal Pradesh. Just let me get my slideshow going once again. Coming back to where we are at the moment, if you sort of go chronologically, the whole issue really came into the limelight on April 19th. And I'm going to take you sector by sector that sort of got activated over a period of time. On April 19th, intelligence reports, these were based on satellites, these were based on ground intelligence from the troops on the border and so on. It came to be reported that Chinese troops, Chinese vehicles were building up in the area opposite Demchok, in the area opposite sort of Galwan, in the area in the Tepsang plain and so on. And there was clearly something brewing. But you know, it was not taken seriously enough by the Indian side. And there was a sort of additional factor at play over here. You know, when winter gets over and spring starts thawing out this area, normally both sides, the Chinese PLA and the Indian army, they do exercises and maneuvers with their forces to sort of check that everything is okay and that nobody has come in during the winter period and that sort of patrolling resumes as normal. But this time there was no sort of Indian sort of troops in being deployed on the ground, and the reason was very simple, because the Indian reserves had been sort of locked down under the COVID-19 sort of pandemic program, and it was felt that, you know, we could afford to not actually go there. So you found that when these Chinese troops were going up, there was an imperative to say, no, this is nothing. This is just their usual springtime maneuvers, and nothing is really going to happen. However, that was quickly bust, that impression, on May the 5th. And that was the first clear incursion into the Galwan area. What happened was that a large number of Chinese troops came, forced their way down into the Galwan Valley, went to the confluence of the Galwan and the Shyok rivers, and sort of overlooked the new road, a new strategic road that India had built from a place called Darbuk down the Shyok River to Daulat Beg Oldi, which, if you see on the map, is right up to the north near the Karakoram Pass. So this road really connects, it's a strategic road, it connects central Ladakh and southern Ladakh with this northern isolated tip near Daulat Beg Oldi. So that was one incursion, and simultaneously the People's Liberation Army crossed at two other points. You will see there below the Galwan Valley, the pointer to hot springs, and there is a point there called Gogra, which is a very sort of dominating height. They ingressed into that area as well. The second ingress took place on May the 9th, and this was nowhere in Ladakh. It took place in Sikkim. in a pass called Nakula. Now, the interesting point is that the 220-kilometer border between Sikkim and Tibet is actually a settled international border. It is not a disputed area at all. Like the rest of the Sino-Indian border, it is the only part of the Sino-Indian border that is actually settled and there is no dispute over. But despite that, the Chinese came across on May the 9th, dossed down about 2 kilometers into Indian territory where they were confronted by Indian troops. And to the present moment, they continue to be there. They continue to be on a sort of eyeball to eyeball confrontation. It's a tense face off over there. The third PLA intrusion took place on May the 19th. You will read there below Hot Springs at the Pangong Tso. The Pangong Tso is a very picturesque lake. Some of you would have seen the movie Three Idiots. The final scenes of that movie were shot on the banks of the Pangong Tso. It's a stunningly beautiful lake. It's a sort of very hot flashpoint right now. It happened on May the 17th, 18th, when a large number of Chinese troops measuring in the thousands came over, encountered an Indian patrol, beat up the Indian soldiers. 72 Indian soldiers were hospitalized as a result of that clash. And it quickly became apparent that this is going to be another sort of flashpoint. In mid-May, there was also a build-up opposite Chushul and Demchok. That's the lowest part that you see over there on the slide. On June the 6th, there was an attempt to de-escalate this when commander-level talks were held between Indian and Chinese commanders near Chushul, and it was agreed to disengage. But on June the 15th, that sad incident took place, which everybody in this audience is certainly aware of, so I will not dwell on that. Suffice to say that 20 Indian soldiers were killed, and the situation got elevated from a mere confrontation into a situation where lethal force was now being used on the border for the first time in 45 years. The last time this happened was in 1975 at the Tulungla Pass near Tawang, where 4 Assam Rifles Javans were killed in an ambush by Chinese soldiers. So that is where we stand at the second week of June. That's just last fortnight. Depsang, that's north near the Karakoram Pass, was activated by the Chinese as well. And they came into they've ingressed about 15 to 17 kilometers into Depsang. They are threatening Daulat Beg Oldi, but they've been confronted by Indian soldiers. And that's where the situation starts now, with some initial reports coming in of Arunachal also likely to be activated, some sort of buildup happening across the border. So that is what you see as the Galwan Valley. You see the river, there's a green marking flowing from that yellow dotted line. That's the LAC, the line of actual control between India and China. The Galwan River crosses there. It's a high mountain area over there. It crosses, flows from east to west, roughly, reaches the part which is marked an estuary, the Galwan estuary, where it flows into the Shyok River. This is a satellite photo that is being used by a lot of analysts right now. You will see that the line of actual control is at Wayanala. The ambush site, which is marked in green, ambush June 15th, that is about 1.5 kilometers inside the Indian side. And these red circles that you see on the hills surrounding the Galwan River are areas where Chinese patrols had initially come in, sat down, but now they come and go. But suffice to say that the Galwan Valley is now a demilitarized zone. It's a buffer zone. Some Indian patrols go there, but nobody stays there. Chinese have established a camp near the Wayanala, and that's where they are located. This is another satellite photograph of the Chinese camp. This is taken from vertically above the camp, so it's a different perspective compared to the previous slide. The red line that you see over there at the bottom left of the corner, That marks the line of actual control. And then you see the Chinese defensive positions marked over there on that white patch of sand in the elbow of the river as it turns from right to left. You can see those pink constructions, those are huts. There's that white circle, that's a helipad, and there are a large number of tents and trucks and vehicles and so on that you can actually see over there. So there is conclusive proof that China is sitting on the Indian side of the line of actual control. It exists there in the satellite photograph right in front of you. The second sort of area that is of real concern you see over here is the Pangong Tso. You see the Pangong Tso with some of the heights, completely barren mountains on its banks. And here, what has happened is that you see, this is the satellite photograph of the lake. It's also got a sort of elbow to it. That elbow has a look above the elbow. There's a sort of annotation there called finger 4 on a spur that comes down, runs down from the high mountain over there that is obscured by the Pangong Tso annotation. That spur finger 4 comes down. You would see a red line marked over there. That used to be the Chinese version of the line of actual control. The Indian version of the line of actual control is further to the right of the map. That's to the east. You see in yellow lettering LAC written over there, running through what is called finger 8. India has always believed and contended that finger 8 is the line of actual control. China has contended that finger 4 is the line of actual control. Indian patrols have always come from the area to the west and patrolled up to the finger 8, where the yellow line is, the yellow LOC. And Chinese patrols have come to finger 4 and gone back from there. What has happened this time, though, is that Chinese patrols didn't go back. They have dossed down on finger 4. They have started constructing defenses over there. Those mountain heights that overlook these fingers, finger 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, have all been occupied by the Chinese. There are several thousand Chinese troops on full defensive mode in this area, and they look like they're there to stay because they are constructing permanent defenses made of concrete and so on and so forth. So what has effectively happened? It's important to sort of get a sense of or to take an analysis of what has happened as a result of all these incidents. Now, the first thing that has happened is that by effectively trespassing across the border at multiple points from north till south, China has effectively shifted the line of control towards India from east to a few kilometers west. The PLA, by virtue of occupying the key points along this new line, actually prevents India from exercising its rights, which were done through patrolling so far. Now those patrols are not allowed to go to India's contention of the line of actual control. And when you don't patrol your sort of claim line, as it were, then you are not really exercising your claim. Secondly, and this is very important to understand, China has taken these measures. One of the key reasons are to protect its vulnerabilities in the AJAI chain. What are its vulnerabilities in the AJAI chain? The key vulnerability is the Western Highway, as we saw on the map a short while ago. From Depsang, that's that place near the Karakoram Pass. Let me head back to the map so that you're there. From Depsang, where Daulat Beg Oldie is annotated and the Karakoram Pass is marked with a star, the territory heading to the right is called the Depsang Plain. And it's a large, flat plain where vehicles can travel and traverse and go without a problem. And China's fear has always been that India can launch tanks and armored vehicles and quickly cover the distance from Depsang to the Western Highway and threaten the Western Highway, or worse still, capture or interdict it. So by going into the Depsang area, the Chinese have preempted this. They are preventing India from going over there. Second issue is the southern approach to Depsang, which goes along this new road that we have built along the Shyok River that passes from Galwan and goes on to the north. This road, China is now able to choke off by its presence at the Galwan Valley. So to safeguard its national highway, it has sort of imposed a block on the Depsang plain and imposed the ability to create a block on the Darbuk-Shyok Daulat Beg Oldi Highway at Galwan, where the Galwan River meets the Shyok. The area around Hot Spring and Pangong Lake also provides a springboard for Indian troops to go and threaten the Aksai Chin Highway. If you notice, the Aksai Chin Highway on this road from Aksai Chin travels south and passes the Pangong Lake very close to it, where Tibet is written. That road, that also provides an access route from India. It's called the southern approach to the Aksai Chin Highway. And by occupying Hot Spring and taking a position at Pangong Lake, China prevents India from doing this as well. Now, why does India why has China suddenly got this bee in its bonnet about protecting the Aksai Chin Highway? Why has it suddenly, after all these years of normal patrolling with a few incidents in between, why has China suddenly decided to take these radical steps to protect the Aksai Chin Highway? The reason is rather simple. Most analysts believe that India's actions in Jammu and Kashmir on August 5th last year, when it effectively annulled Article 370 and divided the state into two union territories, Jammu and Kashmir being one and Ladakh being the other. And more importantly, the statements by the Home Minister, Mr. Amit Shah in Parliament, saying that India will get back its lost territories and naming the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir as well as Aksai Chin specifically, has set the cat amongst the pigeons on the Chinese side. At that time, the Chinese Foreign Office spokeswoman specifically mentioned that this was unacceptable. And now we are seeing what China means by unacceptable, because what China is saying is, or China is signaling, I should say, is that if you're threatening the Aksai Chin, then we will take steps to protect it. So that is one very major reason. It's not enough for Amit Shah to make this statement. At the end of last year, Rajnath Singh went and very prominently inaugurated a bridge over the Shyok River on the highway, the Darbuk Shyok Daulat Beg Oldi Highway. And with great fanfare, said that our highway is ready, arousing Chinese fears even further. So there's too much talk that has been happening, too much posturing, too little understanding of the strategic dimensions of what you're saying, a belief that we are addressing just the domestic audience when we make these statements. But China is listening too. Pakistan is listening too. And they are basing their actions based on what you are saying as a country, what India is signaling. So these have been two very major reasons for this. Extending China's influence to the Shyok Valley also has another very geopolitical effect. China is signaling to its iron brother, Pakistan, they call each other iron brothers, that this Kashmir action has threatened both of us equally. We are both, for the first time, geopolitically, militarily, strategically, and politically joint in our interests and in our threat perceptions of what India is doing. So by coming to the Shuk, the Chinese are actually opening the door for a joint military action by Pakistan and China. Mind you, I am not saying this is anywhere near happening, but this is now a real possibility. With China moving down the Shuk and Pakistan traveling up the Shuk flows into Pakistan occupied Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan a little further. It comes down, does a U-turn and flows up again. By coming down and linking up on the Shuk Valley, Pakistan and China effectively cut off this whole chunk, this ear that you see, that ear-shaped part on the map that India has sort of claimed, and also the Shuk Valley, as well as the Siachen glacier sector. They all get cut off from the rest of India. And that would be a huge geopolitical loss for India. It would be a huge loss of face for India. But China and Pakistan are now coming closer to the point where this might be a real lever that could be exercised. So all of this is just the military case that would excite the People's Liberation Army. There's also the geopolitical case. China has been sort of exercised, as we all know, over India's growing closeness to the United States of America. India's sort of inching forward towards militarizing the quadrilateral alliance, in which a concert of democracies, an anti-China concert of democracies, as Beijing sees it, comes into place with an alliance, not an alliance, but a partnership between the United States, Australia, Japan, and India. So that could be sort of one more thing that is threatening Pakistan. And finally, Pakistan would be also wanting to slap down India and signal to it that we are the preeminent power over here. At the apex of the Asia security pyramid sits just one power, and that is China. So China could be hoping to signal that as well. Finally, us analysts also take note of the economic imperatives that are driving China. Recently, India blocked foreign direct investment from Chinese firms specifically, mentioning that countries with contiguous land borders with India can't invest in Indian firms. And the aim was quite simple and understandable. New Delhi did not want Chinese cash-rich, government-supported companies to pick up Indian distressed companies whose value had been knocked down by the COVID pandemic. So there's also the economic dimension of the 5G rollout in India, and China perhaps wanting to signal that in Chinese firms should be given a level playing field to participate in that as well. So that's where the situation stands right now. And the question that comes to mind is, given the seriousness of this predicament, and it is clearly, I'm sure, after my gloomy forecast, there are some who would believe and agree with me that this is gloomy, all right. Why then is the government soft pedaling and insisting that nothing has happened and that no Chinese troops or foreign troops of any nature have crossed the LAC into Indian territory? I have my sort of views on that, and I'll share it with you. I think over 18 to 19 meetings between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi, Modi may have misunderstood Xi Jinping, but the Chinese president has understood the Indian Prime Minister very well. He has understood that Mr. Modi's political formula of muscular Hindu nationalism does not allow him to admit a debacle or a setback, especially a military setback of any kind. So it was entirely predictable that when she gave the okay for these intrusions, he knew that in a way, he would be supported by the Indian government, which would continue to insist that nothing has happened, even as Chinese troops move into Indian territory. So Modi's sort of statement after the June 15th incident and its subsequent retraction gives you an idea of what exactly the game here is. Modi said, and I quote him exactly, ना कोई घुसा है, ना कोई घुसा हुआ है, which means nobody has entered Indian territory and nobody is currently inside Indian territory. But he was right on, perhaps he could have argued, especially after saying that I was talking only about Galwan, the first clarification, only about Galwan, not about Pangong sector. He may have been right. I don't think he was. I think there were Chinese patrols in Galwan even at that point. But he could have argued that he was right on abhi koi ghusa nahi hai. But when he was arguing that na koi ghusa tha, ya na koi ghusa hai, he is patently wrong over there, because it's a perfect trap from the Chinese side. Because if he says na koi ghusa hai, that would mean that the Indian troops that went in to check the Chinese de-escalation and this sort of withdrawal from Indian territory, did they go into Chinese territory? Because if the encounter took place on Indian territory, then it means Chinese troops were in Indian territory. And if it took place in the Chinese side, as Mr. Modi seemed to imply, then India was tacitly accepting Beijing's position, which is that Indian troops had aggressed into Chinese territory, and therefore the Chinese were justified in fighting back. It was a perfect trap. And I'm sorry to say, but the Indian government fell into it hook, line, and sinker. Also, it means that China now cannot negotiate. I beg your pardon, India cannot negotiate for Chinese troops to withdraw from Indian territory and restore the status quo that existed.
Your voice is breaking, Ajay.
My voice is breaking. Is that better?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay. So it also means that is this fine? Shall I continue?
Yeah, continue.
Okay. It also means that India cannot negotiate for Chinese troops to withdraw from Indian territory and restore the status quo that existed before April, because the Prime Minister himself has said that there are no Chinese troops in Indian territory. So how does India then get up and say, you please vacate Indian territory? It sort of supports the Chinese position once again. Xi Jinping would also have noticed India's sort of limited appetite for confronting China directly, in sharp contrast to his willingness to take on Pakistan, to do surgical strikes, to do air strikes and so on. But with China, the Indian government has trodden very softly over sort of preceding months. Despite China for sort of opposing India's membership into the nuclear suppliers group, despite China on multiple occasions putting a technical hold on the designation of Masood Azhar as a global terrorist, despite China building the China-Pakistan economic corridor through Indian claimed territories in the face of Indian sort of objections, Modi, despite all of this, has soft pedaled in his criticism of China's actions in Taiwan, where it has behaved very threateningly. It's sort of tearing up a treaty in Hong Kong, where it has imposed new security laws. Its actions on curbing the spread of COVID-19. India has sort of been very sort of soft pedally, if I may invent a word, on these issues. Also, China would have noticed that we're in the Doklam confrontation in 2017. After the two sides agreed on a mutual withdrawal, India adhered to its terms of a mutual withdrawal. It did not re-enter Doklam, but China re-entered Doklam, remilitarized the northern half of Doklam, and India just sat quietly and said nothing. So Xi Jinping would have taken note also of the fact that India is hesitant to sort of criticize China and is therefore a soft target for an operation of the kind that we are doing. Before I open for question and answers, I'll just go a little way back into history, just to give you a sense of how the line of actual control came to be what it is and where it stands right now. We could start Sino-Indian border history in the Great Game in the 19th century. We could start with the Simla Conference in 2014. But I'll start in the lead up to the 1962 war. That was the first time China actually spelt out its claim line in 1956. It was reiterated in 1959 by Chow and Lai. And then a new claim line sort of came into being in 1960, which went a little further into Indian territory. And then those 3,000 square kilometers that were captured in the 1962 war also became a part of China's territory, at least its claimed territory. And that's where the line of actual control starts right now. Post the 1962 war, both sides agreed to pull back several kilometers from the border to sort of maintain a safe distance to ensure that, a flashpoint was not reached again, like the Dhola post or like the Konkala incident or like the Longju incident that served as flashpoint, that might serve as flashpoints for another war. So both sides pulled a long way back from the border. India especially, because New Delhi was, by the end of the 1962 war, fairly traumatized by Chinese actions. They wanted to play it absolutely safe and to make sure that nothing happened that might set off, an incident of this case. So we remained a long way off the border for many years. Then in 1975, New Delhi set up a group called the China Study Group that was directed specifically to focus on China-related issues and to recommend strategy and how to deal with China. It was a very hush-hush organization. It still exists. It's still a very hush-hush organization. Key elements of China policy are still made by the China Study Group. And what the China Study Group did was, it said that we will allow the Indian Army to move back closer to the border, but we will set up a limit of patrolling short of the LAC to ensure that nobody crosses the LAC even by mistake and triggers off another incident. So a limit of patrolling was established in 1975. And in 1983, that limit of patrolling was moved even closer to the LAC. It still exists in very many places. It's sort of like in some places, it's about a kilometer short of the line of control. In others, it's 1.5 kilometers. So while Chinese soldiers come and patrol right up to their claim line, the Indian soldiers patrol only up to their limit of patrolling, which is a little short of their claim line. And that's a sort of an interesting sort of dimension or difference between the two. I'll also flag a date, November 1985, during the 6th round of border talks between India and China. China signaled, up till then, China had been signaling that we can resolve the border and reach a solution on the basis of what is called an East for West swap. India would concede China's claims in the Western sector, that is, give Aksai Chin to China and a few other niblets of territory that it claims. And in exchange, China will drop its claim to Arunachal Pradesh in the east, surrender its claim to what it calls South Tibet. It was a good deal. It still is a good deal. If it was offered today, New Delhi would bite China's hand off in trying to accept it. But on November 1985, in the 6th round of border talks, China signaled for the first time that India would also have to make substantial concessions in the eastern sector, in Arunachal Pradesh. And India takes that to mean that it would have to surrender its claim to the Tawang Tract, which it's not likely to do. It's a very strategically important piece of territory. So that I was just wanting to flag that date as well. A year later, the Sumdorongchu incident took place in Arunachal Pradesh, also in the Tawang sector, where a Chinese sort of patrol occupied a post claimed by India. India completely built up troops and said, we will not surrender on this issue. And I am flagging this for you because I want to sort of illustrate to you how local military commanders can actually change the direction of policy. There was a corps commander who was commanding that corps, 4 Corps in Tezpur, which was responsible for this area, Sundarongchu, where the Chinese had come and sat. And this officer, who was a firebrand, said, I am not going to allow China to nibble away at my territory. I will throw the Chinese out. And New Delhi jumped on his case and said, no, don't trigger an incident. The Chinese will mobilize across the border. There'll be another war and so on and so forth. This officer insisted. He said, I'm not asking you for any resources. I'd want no additional troops. My own troops will do the job. Sundarongchu became into a symbol of Indian strategic handling of a border incursion. And it was very, very sort of carefully noted by China that the Indian attitude seems to be changing. And the outcome of that was, over a sort of period of time, China signaled that it wanted to talk, and Rajiv Gandhi visited Beijing in 1988. And that led to these 5 agreements in 1993, 1996, 2005, 2012, and 2013. 5 agreements were signed between India and China on confidence building measures on the border, the line of actual control. This began with the 1993 Peace and Tranquility Agreement, and it was basically an agreement between 2 sovereign equals that their military will behave in a manner that does not trigger another crisis. It was a very important agreement and would have still been holding had not something changed in the Chinese attitude sometime around 2010, 2011, when China realized that it was becoming a big power. There then came a series of incursions and incidents on the Indian border. Depsang 2012, Chumar 2013, and Doklam 2017, that actually led to the current face-off, where we have seen a tendency for patrols not to adhere to the Peace and Tranquility Agreement and the confidence building measures, but instead to start jostling and pushing each other and creating problems. No shots have been fired so far. That's one saving grace. But this recent incident of June the 15th was the natural culmination point of this downslide in relations and downslide in behavior of the 2 militaries, specifically the PLA, on the line of actual control. I think I've gone on a little longer than I intended to, but I'll call it off here and I'll open the floor for question and answers. Ajay, over to you.
Thank you, Vikram here, Ajay, and I think you have clinically analyzed the situation. That shows what we have when an expert talks to us. And we also have a surfeit of questions. I don't know how much we can answer, but how many we can answer, but I will go one after the other. But
yeah. Would you now want to close your screen sharing?
Oh, yeah, sure. The question is how? Okay. Stop share. Okay, yeah. Stop share. I'm becoming technically savvy at addressing this meeting.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
This is perfect.
So there are many questions, but I'm sure that most of these questions are you have answered, because from what I've heard in the last 45 minutes, it's been a clinical analysis of the situation at the border. But most of the questions, some of the questions are in this category. Jack Hunter asks us, what are India's military options against China? At the time, is our Air Force ready to take on China? And how politicized is the Indian military system?
Should I go with that, or are there any linked questions?
Good.
Okay. India's military options are basically threefold. And a lot of this depends on how China takes things forward from here. One option, and this is the option which the Indian military has already exercised and is in the process of exercising, involves sitting down in front of the Chinese that have ingressed into Indian territory in what is called mirror deployment. Just face to face to prevent them from ingressing any further, from going any deeper into Indian territory, and to sort of signal that the Indian military was ready to take them on. This goes hand in hand with a larger deployment in areas to the rear, to the interior of India, where you mobilize more forces and move them up, so that in the event of a situation escalating any further, in the event of fighting breaking out, or in the event of China committing its reserves, which are still on the Chinese side of the LAC, in both in Depsang, in the Galwan area, in the Pangong area, in the Demchok area. There's an estimation in some quarters that China might have as much as 2 mechanized divisions. That's about 35,000 troops with tanks, artillery, air support, ready to sort of be thrown into the fray in case of any escalation by the Indians. So the Indians would have to also mirror that. The second option for India is to not continue sort of worrying about what areas China has occupied, but to go into empty areas where Chinese defenses are not that strong, and to counter-occupy Chinese territory as well, which could then be traded off in a border negotiation for the territory that China has occupied. That would be a subsequent negotiation phase. But it would give India cards to play at the negotiating table. It would give India something to sort of negotiate and to hand over to China in exchange for its territories. And it would be a proactive option. It would be sort of an option that would not make India seem weak and watery in its response, but proactive, and it would give China cause for concern. It might make China change its opinion of India as a soft touch, as a country that you can play around with and walk into at your sort of whim and fancy, and there will be no consequences. Finally, there is the question of sort of allowing escalation to take place. In fact, encouraging escalation and then falling back on your nuclear option. This is, of course, a very risky option. This would mean sort of an outbreak of fairly extensive fighting. And once a nuclear sort of confrontation takes place, and I'm not talking about the actual use of weapons, I'm talking about the signaling of the use of weapons, there is no telling which direction that might go. So these are, in my opinion, the military options. On your question of air support, India's air support combat fighter numbers are significantly lower than those of the Chinese. The Chinese sort of are concentrated for now mainly in mainland China. They have annual exercises where they deploy to airfields in Tibet, like Nadi Gunsa and other ones, Shigatse and so on. They could be used from there against Indian troops. It is important to note that in the 1962 war, India decided against using air power, a decision that many felt in retrospect was a misguided one. Because Indian air support, which would operate from lower altitudes, take off from lower altitudes, allows planes to get airborne with greater fuel loads, greater weapon loads than are available to planes that are taking off from the high altitudes of Tibet, where the oxygen levels are lower and the engines don't generate that much power. Some of this can be obviated from the Chinese side by use of air-to-air refueling, which means that you take off with a full weapons load but a low fuel load, and then refuel air-to-air after taking off before going for your mission. But that only adds so much to your sort of ability to carry weapons. India would still be at an advantage. The problem with assessing PLA ability is that the PLA has not been in a fight for very long. You know, while it is technologically well equipped, technologically sort of indigenous solutions have been brought to bear, there is still sort of some questions over how well all this will work in war. And we hope that it is not against India that China finds out whether it works or doesn't work.
There's another question here. Can we link this act by China to the US moving out of Afghanistan, which was necessitated India to get into POK to have direct access to Afghanistan?
It is hard to link what is happening in Afghanistan with what is happening in Ladakh. There could conceivably be linkages to militant activity. There could conceivably be linkages to sort of activity on the line of control with Pakistan, where there is actually a direct sort of link between, or a very short link between Afghanistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan, and Kashmir, which is an Indian province. But I would be hesitant to look at Afghanistan as a root cause for what is happening. It is more likely to be the strategic relationship between India and China, India and the United States, I beg your pardon. It's more likely to be perceived provocation from the moves in Kashmir that India has made, and the other things that we spoke about. I'm not so sure that Afghanistan would have had a direct role to play. India's role in Afghanistan has been, in any case, very humanitarian aid oriented and very non-kinetic, if I may use that phrase. So I don't think that in itself would have been a major factor.
Ajay, do you think China has been working on a long-term strategy over the last 15, 20 years to establish its hegemony across a large part of region outside its own territories? And this is a natural extension of that long-term plan?
Yes, I do think so. I think that China has very single-mindedly, more than any major power in history, it has actually laid down milestones in years. You know, by the 60th anniversary of this, we will do this. By the 75th anniversary of this, we'll do this. And by the 100th anniversary of the establishment of Communist China, we will become a global power. They have spelt it out for all of us in writing and in multiple documents. Why would we doubt what China is saying? They clearly have the intention. They clearly have the ability. They clearly have the leadership. They clearly have the lack of scruple that is involved in moving towards a great power sort of orientation. China has got a very strong civilizational sense of itself, and its move to being a great power is considered in Chinese circles to be the absolute logical return of the great power status that it has enjoyed for so many centuries earlier. There's nothing to doubt in this. This should be taken as an absolute granted, and India should base its strategy, its China strategy, at least on that.
I'll ask one more question. How real does a war look? And if a war does happen, what are our chances of meeting that war on at a military level?
Ajay, before Mr. Shukla answers the question, I want to tell you, if there's a war, we're going to send Arnab Goswami and he'll win the war for us.
We've lost the war then. We've lost the war then. I would say this, and I'm not being gloomy and depressing. We are closer to a Sino-Indian war today than at any time since 1962. There is an intent that I see in what China is doing, in the way that it has built up forces, in the purposefulness with which it has entered Indian territory, in the ruthlessness with which it is continuing to progress operations, in this complete sort of single-mindedness with which it is engaging in dialogue at the diplomatic level and the military level together, with not moving any troops at all from the positions they have occupied. China is here to stay, at least by all signals that we see today. It has not decided to thin out troops. It is only strengthening its defenses. And that leaves India with a very hard choice. Is India going to take hard action to evict the Chinese or to bypass the Chinese? Or is India going to accept the status quo? For India, which has a pretty good civilizational sense of its own power and its own place in history and current affairs, to just accept what is going on would be a difficult thing. So I think that you could well have an escalation of tensions. Whether it will escalate all the way to war, I don't know. I sincerely hope not. I hope better sense prevails on one or the other side. But I go back to my formulation. This is the worst it's been since 1962.
So what should India do? Simple.
I would not presume to sort of guide Mr. Modi, who now has a hard reverse gear to engage. But I will say this, the government of India is in possession of information which none of us are in possession of. There is satellite intelligence that they have. There is technical radio intelligence, communications intelligence that they have. They are in possession of one crucial thing that none of us are in possession of, which is that presumably in the diplomatic dialogue, China would have signaled or given a sense of why it is doing this and what are its specific demands of India. I think that based on that, India will be making its key decisions. If those demands are unacceptable, if those demands involve too much of humiliation for India, if those demands involve a complete blow to India's status as a rising power, then I don't think India would be able to do anything except take this forward towards the use of force. It sort of depends really on what is being talked behind the scenes right now. I hope they're finding a solution.
There's a series of questions here on what's the present status in Arunachal Pradesh, and what about the legitimacy of claims of Chinese claims in Arunachal Pradesh and Galwan? And I have a follow-up question on that. Did Chou En-lai offer this as a solution that you give up Aksai Chin for us to accept Arunachal?
Yes, the solution, the answer to that latter part of the question is yes. Numerous accounts of the visits of Chou En-lai to India indicate that yes, indeed, China did make that offer. The offer was on the table for many years. In 1983, Deng Xiaoping again signaled the same offer, but 2 years later, they pulled it off the table. There is belief that one of the reasons why they did so was that having had time to go through the Tibetan archives in Lhasa, they found better sort of arguments for Tibetan control over Tawang. And therefore decided to put Tawang in as a sort of demand point as well. It is important to remember that until 1951, that's 4 years after independence, Tibet continued to exercise administrative jurisdiction over Tawang. Only in 1951 did an Indian Assam Rifles patrol actually march into Tawang and ask the Tibetan administrators to leave, since this was Indian territory. It indicates that China at least believes that it has a case on Tawang. It can argue the case. It may decide at a later stage to sort of throw Tawang as a bargaining chip in exchange for other concessions elsewhere, something that might provide better protection, for example, to the Aksai Chin highway. Because Tawang sort of has only one real value for the Chinese, and that is that it's a center of Buddhist theology. It houses the Tawang monastery, which radiates power and Buddhist influence across the border. And, you know, China is also very sensitive about the Dalai Lama's presence in India and the presence of 120,000 Tibetan refugees. So all of that combined with Tawang monastery and its sort of power might be something that makes it a must-have for China. On the other hand, it's also a must-have for India. There's too much emotive baggage to Tawang. It was lost in 1962. China ruled it for a month, more than a month actually, before it withdrew across the border. China tried its best to tell the people of Tawang that, look at you and look at us. Are you more like us or are you more like the Indians? But to their credit, the people of Tawang did not waver in their support for even 1 minute. They had seen what China had done to the Buddhists of Tibet over the preceding decade, and they were not going to follow that same fate. So Tawang, I beg your pardon, remains one of the most staunchly Indian districts of the country, and that is not likely to change. So this is true of Arunachal Pradesh in general. The insurgency sort of written atmosphere of the Northeast does not apply to the Arunachal Pradesh. Arunachal Pradesh is one of India's most staunchly Indian states.
That's very, very heartening to hear. There's another question here: is the relationship with Nepal over India and Nepal, and have we lost it? And can we ever renegotiate with the older normalcy? And will China use that as a weapon now?
China is already using Nepal as a weapon. China is using it with a mix of carrots and sticks. Chinese pressure on Nepal, especially at their border crossings, is very evident. At that border crossing at the Friendship Highway, you see no Nepalese troops over there. When you go there, you see mainly PLA soldiers and border guards. So they've effectively taken control of that crossing. They also put a lot of pressure on the Nepalese leadership to sort of toe the Chinese line against India. And it has to be said, and it has to be conceded, that New Delhi has blundered massively in handling its relationship with Nepal. And that makes Nepal a ripe fig to fall into China's lap. We have achieved success in many relationships, Bangladesh being one of them, where we have sort of improved relations a long way. But Nepal is in a bad way, the relationship. And unless there is statesmanship exercised by India and a degree of magnanimity shown and a degree of big brotherliness, I think China will continue to harbor the sense of grievance that it has at being, and a lot of this is that small power versus big power sort of natural syndrome. They feel exploited. They feel that they don't get their due. They feel that India should give them more. And the fact of the matter is that if India wants to be a regional power, it will have to give them more. It will have to concede more than it gets. It does that with Bhutan. It does that with Afghanistan. It does that with Maldives. It does that with a lot of countries. But with Nepal, I'm afraid it's been less forthcoming. The sort of the line of approach that India followed in imposing a blockade on Nepal, and we will show Nepal what Indian power is, and so on. It was entirely the wrong way to go. So Nepal has been mishandled, and Nepal relationship needs to be repaired.
Which other major power will side India and support India if there is a configuration?
Since this crisis started in April the 19th, I used the date at which the Chinese buildup was detected. 3 occasions have taken place in which senior US officials have called up the Indian establishment and offered support and said that let us know if there's anything that we can do. So far, the Indian government has said we will handle China on our own. The belief is that the problem is resolvable. But the United States will come to our help at a moment's notice. For them, it will be the Indian sort of fig falling into their lap, if I may reuse that phrase. Because so far, India has been very restrained in pursuing its relationship with the United States. It has come nowhere near an alliance. It has sort of not even agreed to do joint patrolling. Numerous offers of the US for joint patrolling of the Indian Ocean it is maintaining a certain distance. And the United States would be very happy to see that distance bridged. And it would come to India's aid the way it did in 1962, with weapons, with aircraft, with military advice. So to that extent, India will not find itself alone. But the problem will be with Russia, because Russia is now walking a balancing act between India and China. It has not taken a position on this incident as well. It has said India and China should sort this out itself. So your traditional strategic partner, Russia, will be maintaining some distance, I predict, whereas the United States will come and offer support in a big way.
Have you delayed recognizing Taiwan for too long? And is that don't you think that in any case we have trade relationship with Taiwan? And how do you see that in the overall picture?
Well, China has sort of, in its enunciations of vital national interest, it has sort of included Taiwan, and it has said that any sort of action to foment separatism in Taiwan or promote separatism in Taiwan is an action that will go against China's vital national interests. It has said the same thing about Tibet. So while India could play the Tibet card or play the Taiwan card, it needs to be conscious that it would be fiddling with China's designated vital national interests. And the response from the Chinese side will almost certainly be to fiddle with India's vital national interests. And Kashmir is sitting there waiting to be fiddled with. It's a situation that India has mishandled massively. The August 5th change of designation and change of status of Jammu and Kashmir has alienated even the most diehard and staunch Indian supporters in Kashmir. Kashmir is against India almost to a man, and we absolutely are vulnerable to meddling in Kashmir. And I would not want to create a situation where I would encourage China to also join the fray and to start acting against India's interests in Kashmir.
Was there anything particular about this moment why China acted?
Anything particular about this moment
This
why
time.
China acted?
Yes.
Well, I already brought that out in my presentation. It was a combination of multiple issues, economic issues. It was a combination of strategic issues. It was a combination of the need to signal support to Pakistan. It was the combination of India's actions in Jammu and Kashmir. It was a combination of Indian bluster. It was a combination of the belief that India will not be able to respond strongly because India hasn't responded strongly in the past. So there's a huge coming together of multiple reasons that might have led China to act in the way that it did.
If you read the Pakistani newspapers, they say that India has an expansionist view. That's what some of the Chinese newspapers also say, that from their point of view, they see India having this particular government has an expansionist view, and that is the cause of the problem.
Well, I don't think we should go by what Pakistan says. I think that Pakistan is almost certainly going to say India has an expansionist view. The fact of the matter is that most analysts all across the globe agree that India is a status quo power and Pakistan is the revisionist power. And the reason is that Kashmir has legally and lawfully acceded to India, and Pakistan is seeking to change that status through armed action. Pakistan is also sort of playing a far more revisionist role in Afghanistan, whereas India is sort of trying to preserve the status quo, trying to preserve the existing elected Afghan government. So I wouldn't go by Pakistan's allegations. Pakistan has to make diplomatic points, and Pakistan is doing that. I don't blame them for it. But I think that if anything, India has been definitely mild and sort of laid back and subservient in its approach to overall global great power. I don't think it is pressed as hard as it could have or as it should have for things that should have been its due. But that's the way India is. I think that India has a preoccupation with internal politics, with internal development, and that is the way it should be. I don't think we should be going around at this stage being a revisionist power, projecting power across the globe. We have enough problems inside. We have enough development work to do within the country. That's where we should be focusing on.
Do you also see it as an intelligence failure? Like in Kargil?
It was an intelligence failure, but in a different way. This time we got intelligence and we had every indication that the Chinese were mobilizing and that they were sort of coming in numbers to the area opposite the Indian border. Where the mistake lay was in assessment. It was assessed by the Indian side that this is not anything unusual and this is a regular pattern. This is in conformity with patterns of the past. China will mobilize, China will deploy, China will do its exercises, and then the troops will go back where they came from. Except that China had other plans. So to that extent, it is an intelligence failure. It's an intelligence failure of a different kind. And I think it was an intelligence failure where people wanted to hear something. You know, India was reeling under this COVID pandemic. India was trying to isolate its troops. And they didn't want to hear that there's a huge problem brewing up on the border and you need to mobilize and get there fast. So sometimes you find that intelligence is tailored to what the recipient wants to hear. It's one of those natural phenomena in intelligence assessment. So I would say that yes, there was a degree of intelligence failure, but it's now an operational issue. It's now an issue which is squarely in the hands of operational planners and executors. So to that extent, intelligence has less role to play now.
One friend is asking, what is the situation of the pandemic in the territories where this is happening? Is there a low load? Is that why activities are still happening from both sides?
Well, the last I recall, Ladakh had a caseload of 78 people, but that was some time back. But the population density is so low there that, you know, even 78 seems like a lot. Ladakh is also sort of pretty primitive in terms of medical facilities and so on. There hasn't been a lot of healthcare development in Ladakh. The people there are, in any case, you know, where once you come to know them, they're such a hardy lot and they get along with so little that the Indian Planning Commission has never even thought of giving Ladakh a sort of a unique status and sort of developing healthcare facilities over there. So I think that Ladakh is concerned about the COVID issue. It has had a number of patients, enough to worry it, but it's not yet in the league of Tamil Nadu, Delhi, Maharashtra, and others.
Is Hot Spring and Gogra, are they physically occupied by China or by India?
Hot Springs and Gogra are not towns or villages or anything. There is no habitation over there. They are points on a map. And when you say hot springs, you're referring to an area on the line of actual control. Beg your pardon. You're referring to a place on the line of actual control. Now in Gogra, the Chinese have ingressed when I last heard, which was yesterday, about 3 kilometers into the Indian side. So yes, I would say they're in possession.
Which is not very good news.
So, it isn't good news. They're in possession at multiple points along the line of actual control.
So the question here, and I too wanted to ask you the same question. Then do you see India having some trouble in Siachen also?
Oh, well, the Siachen conundrum I have already sort of laid out. If Pakistan and China operate along the Shyok axis and link up on the Shyok, India would have lost Siachen. India would have lost the Nubra Valley. India would have lost this whole Darbuk area. India would have lost the Daulatbo Bay Goldie area. This is all sort of seriously threatened areas. These are viable military operations that we are contemplating over here from Pakistan and from China. The only thing that is presumably holding them back is what consequences might follow from India, not just in terms of the threat of nuclear use, but also in terms of pushing India into the lap of the United States, into alienating India forever, all for a piece of territory that really doesn't sort of offer very much beyond a great scenery. Pakistan's sort of acting in Siachen itself, no. It has tried that many times in the past years, since 1984, when India occupied the Saltoro Ridge. India occupies all the dominating heights on Siachen. India completely controls Siachen. Pakistani troops cannot even visually see the glacier any longer. They are obstructed by the Saltoro Ridge, and India holds the Saltoro Ridge. The glacier itself doesn't have troops on it, troop deployment. It's so thoroughly protected. So Pakistan is not in a position to change anything in the Siachen Glacier, but this joint operation with China poses a certain degree of threat, which India, I'm sure, is looking at.
There's an interesting question, slightly longish, but I'll read it for you. In 2017, the Indian Army had a similar face-off with PLA in the Bhutanese territory of Doklam. The face-off lasted 73 days. Doklam was a strategic plateau at the tri-junction of India, Bhutan and China border, gifted to India by Bhutan as India is responsible for Bhutan's defense. The Doklam Plateau commands an excellent view of the China's Chumbi Valley. That time we let the Chinese shift the status quo in their favor. That time also same claims that no Indian territory was lost were made. And that is true because the country which lost the territory was Bhutan. The capture of heights is the main intent of PLA. Being in position of height gives a big advantage to armies being in Indian Army or PLA. This is what happened in Depsang, Chumar and Doklam and Galwan. What do you say?
Well, I agree almost 99% with what this question sort of the postulations it poses. He's absolutely correct. Where I would take issue is Bhutan has not effectively gifted Doklam to India. Bhutan has gifted the responsibility for protecting Doklam to India. That too, not entirely. There is a Royal Bhutanese Army that is charged with responsibility as well. But Bhutan, being a small country and a country that does not spend too much on militaries, is naturally dependent on India. He's also correct in saying that we were taken for a ride during the withdrawal process. That China came back and reoccupied the areas it had vacated. He's also correct in saying that capturing the heights is everything. Which is why these heights overlooking the Galwan Valley, the shoulders of the estuary, the heights overlooking the Pangong Lake are already being sort of occupied by China, and they're digging defenses and sort of beefing up their presence on these heights. So to that extent, I mean, every soldier knows and every infantryman is brought up cutting his teeth on this axiom that the heights and control of the heights is everything. That's the basic tenet of mountain warfare. And the Chinese for sure know that. And they're taking action to consolidate their presence based on this axiom.
Anyway, a friend has just informed.
Sorry, do you think we should, the question here, we should have joined the OBOR? Maybe tactically that would have softened China's stand against us.
That's a very sort of arguable point from both sides. I personally tend to believe that China is a monster that has to be fed. And if you feed him one thing, he will demand another. So whether if you concede on OBOR or on the CPEC as the manifestation of Belt and Road Initiative is, at least for us, China would probably then sort of ask for something more and then ask for something more. But the question really is the decision on whether to concede on a point or not concede on a point should not be made based on whether the originator will be offended or will take it to heart or will see it as a friendly gesture. Rather, such decisions have to be made based on whether they suit the national Indian interests, whether it works out to India's economic interests, whether Indian trade flows will be enhanced by the Belt and Road project that they are building in Pakistan. And if so, if India concludes that there are advantages to be gained, then it has to think through the whole process of how it will link into that infrastructure, what will be its shares, what will be our exports that benefit from that, what could we import down that route. So this is an economic issue. It's not a strategic sort of issue of placating a country. And I don't think that the decision should be made based on that account.
I hope you don't mind another 5-7 minutes.
Yeah, I'm perfectly fine.
Okay. Vikram, you had a question or should I go ahead? You are... Okay. One question is, it's not a question, it's an information given by one of the participants that today morning at the Mann Ki Baat, the Prime Minister has declared that India has given China a befitting reply. I have no idea whether this is true or not, but this is in the question that has been posed. In which case, we have little to worry.
Yeah, if we've given China a befitting reply, then we no need to firstly congratulate ourselves and secondly wait for China's reply to that reply. When you start escalating a particular issue or a confrontation, you don't decide when that escalation closes. There are two people who get to vote in that and two sides that will have a vote. I'm not sure what the Prime Minister was speaking about. Perhaps he was speaking about the casualties caused to the Chinese by our brave soldiers who were caught up in that June 15th clash. If he's talking about that, then it's one thing. Or if he's talking about another incident that has taken place over the last couple of days, then we have the potential for escalation. And I'm sure that would have been taken into account and factored in before we escalated ourselves. But escalation is a two-edged sword, and that has to always be borne in mind.
But why does the Prime Minister of India make statements like this? I don't see Xi Jinping making statements like that. Why can't he allow his defense minister or somebody else to make the statements?
I had sort of touched on the sort of issue of muscular Hindu nationalism.
Yeah.
And I will add to that the Chapan Chhati narrative, which which has the Prime Minister placing himself center stage in all manly activities. You would recall that he also claimed having advised the Air Force to stage the Balakot attack that night, even though there were clouds, because clouds would hide the fighters when they went across. So I think there's a sort of faintly ridiculous brand of self-centeredness that you see over here. It is not enough for the defense minister to make a statement or for any other minister. It has to be made by the Prime Minister himself. And that is taken up by these hordes of supporters who have sort of seen Mr. Modi in godly light and who believe that he can do anything and is capable of any feat.
Now, the question of banning of Chinese goods seems a foolish thing to do. But what happens if China decides to ban exports to India? We'll be doomed even faster.
Ajay, we're interlinked economies.
Exactly.
For example, the pharmaceutical sector, which is one of India's big cash cow foreign exchange earners, is based almost to a very large degree. I don't know the exact percentage on bulk drug formulations coming from China. The same is true of other industries as well, where there are interlinkages across the border. And to get the best out of your sort of economy, that's the way it has to be. So, I mean, the United States, despite its strategic contest with China, continues to deal with Chinese supply chains and propagate those supply chains on a major way. Japan, which is one of China's major competitors in the Asia Pacific, which has a boundary dispute, a maritime dispute with China, has China as its biggest trading partner. The same is true of countries like Vietnam, Philippines, all over the place. If India wants to deny itself the benefits of the Chinese economy, then the Indian economy will suffer as well. That's something that every economist is in agreement on.
But then you're saying then we can never fight China.
We can never, what, beg your pardon?
Never fight China because they have a trade hold on us and they can dictate terms. Is it what you're saying?
Well, I don't know this argument that countries that trade together don't fight wars against each other was conclusively disproved in 1914 when Germany and England went to war. So there isn't really a direct established linkage between trade and war. War can sort of disrupt trade. War can bring trade to a temporary halt. Then the economic logic of trade has a certain momentum of its own. I would sort of not subscribe to the argument that just because India and China have a trade relationship, and for example, the bulk drugs that India uses comes from China, the two will never fight. I don't accept that linkage.
Yes.
Okay, Ajay, there are 204 questions in the question and answer box, but this is only just about how much we can load onto you.
I hope it doesn't mean that I've confused everyone.
No, this was an absolutely wonderful session.
Wonderful.
Brilliant talk.
I enjoyed it, Ajay. I enjoyed it very much myself.
So much depth and so much information. We'll all have to run through your talk once again or twice again to really digest it. I cannot thank you enough for coming over. The response has been overwhelming, as you could see in the chat box. Thank you very much, Ajay.
Thank you very much, Ajay. Thank you, Vikram. It was a great pleasure being there.
This session is going to be put up on YouTube by evening or tomorrow morning. I'll send you a link of that. And we'll keep following you on your blogs and writings and interventions.
Thank you so much, Ajay. It was a pleasure being with Manthan.
Thank you. Thank you. And we'll have you again, once again.
I would like.
Yeah. And ladies and gentlemen, we have a very interesting session on the food crisis next Sunday. Keep coming. Thank you very much. You could click on the leave button, Ajay. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, all of you.
You didn't mention that the food crisis was Deepa Sinha.
I showed the slide. The big, yeah. Good session.
Good session.
Very good.
Everyone will say, no, his leanings are well known, and that's why. Have you stopped recording?
No, not yet.
No, we're not much stronger there.
I think relatively, China is much stronger than India, and that asymmetry is still there between 1962 and 2020. Anyway, Ajay, you have arrived. I mean, I always thought Dashavatar is a myth, but now I notice that it's not true, and you come in various forms, shapes, sizes.
It was more than Dashavatar.
More than Dashavatar, I know. Are the Dasavatars still around?
Okay.
They're still around.
Chalo, I'm closing it.
Right on. Bye.
Now.